This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Giant Mouse Ace REO. My goal with this review is for it to be the only thing that you need to watch to know whether you want to get this knife or not, and to get you in and out in less than 15 minutes. Let's see if we can get that done. So first, we're going to start off with some specs. So the Giant Mouse Ace REO here is a relatively recent model from Giant Mouse, made in Italy. All right, they don't mark their place of origin on their blades, but this is made in Italy, which I assume is made by Maniago knife manufacturers or Fox Knives, one of the two. Blade steel here is Magna Cut, which they have started using pretty regularly. You've got a 3.325 inch or 3 3/8 inch satin finished blade in that Magna Cut, 125 thousandths thick. Knife is just under 8 inches overall and comes in at 2.7 ounces, which especially for a Giant Mouse is quite light. The design philosophy of this one, according to Giant Mouse themselves, so this is called the REO after the REO manufacturing company, REO Motor Car Company, which is an old motor car company in Lansing, Michigan. Giant Mouse is now based in Michigan, and the headquarters, or what used to be the headquarters of REO Motor Car, is not far from their current headquarters as a company. And so this was meant to be a sleeker knife that sort of harkens back to some of those automotive design cues. Sleeker, lighter, just a bit of that sort of urban feel to it. And it is meant as a tribute to that REO Motor Car Company. You got denim canvas micarta handles on this one with the typical, this one might not be brass, this one might be a titanium backspacer here. You got their jimping up on the spine of the blade as they typically do, and a deep carry wire clip. And this is a liner lock that runs on bearings. Those are your specs for your Giant Mouse Ace REO here. Which brings us to part 2, which is the positives. What is good about this knife? What do I like about this knife? Oh, and I didn't say $195 for this knife, and probably about $150 on the secondary market. So this one does hold its value pretty well, which modern Giant Mouses tend to. All right, things that I like. The first thing that stands out about the Ace REO, this is the most fidgety knife that Giant Mouse has ever made. Again, it runs on bearings, and you can see this action snaps out easily and drops shut easily. Medium to light detent. It does come out pretty easily, but it's easy to slow roll out, it's easy to thumb flick out, and it's also easy to reverse flick out. And I'm not great at the reverse flick, but it's easy to do here. They've nicely chamfered the opening hole here, but it's still got enough there that your thumb can get in there and disengage it and open it just like that. And this does drop shut despite having a relatively light blade. The bearings help with that, and it does feel a little rattly, but there is no play, there's no lock rock, anything like that. Nothing when it's locked up, and it centers up nicely. So the action is very well down on this one. Second thing that's great, this is super light and sleek. Giant Mouse historically has made a lot of big chunkers of knives. They've made knives that are great in the hand, cut nicely, have great ergonomics, but are huge. Like, and I'll reference this a few other times in the review, like your Biblia, which is one of their early models, is a perfect example of that. This thing is great when you're using it. These ergonomic lines are great, but it is thick, it is chunky, it is heavy, and the manufacturing quality is okay. The REO is not any of those things. The REO is very, very slim in the pocket. This takes up very little space. It is relatively slim overall. You got, again, 125 thousandths blade stock, which is not that thick, and very slim scales with inset liners. And you've just got, that light action as well. Makes it just feel light and sleek. Most of these liners here, even though there are liners, they're relatively thin, and they do some milling, which keeps your weight down at 2.7 ounces. And the fact that this is just such a squat knife, or a slim knife, does help keep that weight down. And so this thing is great in the pocket. It carries almost invisibly. It almost feels like about the same size as a pen in your pocket. A thick pen, but still, it feels closer to a pen than a knife in your pocket, which is fantastic, and again is a departure for Giant Mouse. Next thing I like is this handle finishing. you've got a diamond pattern on top of a contoured handle here, which is a pretty complex machining pattern overall. And then you've got a nice chamfer all the way around the edge, which works well. So this finished pattern, which you can really see best on the back here, gives you a ton of grip. You add canvas micarta, the grip inherent to that, and then you put a diamond pattern, and then you put a contour. There's tons of grip to this knife. It's also just visually very interesting. One of the great things about micarta when you put a pattern on this is you see, as you wear it in, you see variation between those peaks and valleys, and it just looks really nice, and it gets even nicer with wear. So everything is flush. Your screws are flush. Just the overall design and finish of the handle here is a little bit sleeker, a little bit nicer, a little bit cooler than what Giant Mouse tends to do. And you combine that with the ergonomic lines that they have, and that sort of goes into my third point. The third thing I like is great handle ergonomics for what it is. You've got relatively gradual curves, but you do have curves here. There's not a straight line really anywhere on the knife. Even this here has a very subtle curve to it. Now, Anso and Vox are a couple of the best knife designers, especially ergonomically in the industry, and a lot of that shows here. This, despite being a slim knife, and slim knives can have some ergonomic problems, fits very nicely and neatly in the hand. This curve goes right into your palm. This finger index here works really well, whether you want to get your middle finger in there or your index finger in there. When you want to choke up, you can even choke up and get your ring finger in there, grab this blade. You combine that with the contouring and with the texture that this diamond pattern gives with the micarta on top of it. This ends up being a very ergonomic handle, a very nice handle to hold, again, despite being slim. It's not going to feel hand-filling, but the way that it nestles between your finger and your palm as you grip it is very satisfying and a lot better than a lot of other slim knives. This particular finger index up here does a really good job of giving your hand something to really purchase on and something that really does lock your hand in place. This one ergonomic feature does a lot to make this handle feel secure. And then the next thing is the blade shape here. And it's really the other thing that's very nice about this knife. This is a very sleek and interesting blade shape that happens to be useful. So again, if you look at traditional Giant Mouse blades, they tend to be sort of the opposite of this. They tend to be very tall, very chunky. This one is very light and lean and pointy. This tip, very good for pointing, stuff like that. And this whole blade, and it sort of interacts with the ergonomics, it's very easy to control. It feels almost like a paring knife in the hand, where if you want to, do detail cuts, you can pinch right up on that blade, hold it just like that, and get right to that edge, do whatever sort of fine detail cuts you need. Because it's so lean and so slim, it's very easy to get in between stuff, to get around stuff, to make those precise cuts, including your utility cuts. Very easy to get up to this tip, drag it, do drag cuts, things like that. And because it's basically all belly, it's not bad for your bigger slicing cuts either. You got all belly here, you got a full flat grind from blade stock that isn't thick. So even when I'm doing rougher stuff, like for example, I broke down a bunch of boxes with this one, it does the job fine. Again, a lot of the handle ergonomics here are doing the work, but the fact that this blade stock is not too thin, the fact that, it parts material easily because of that full flat grind, and because you've got this nice even belly the whole way, as you're pushing it gradually through things like breaking down a large piece of cardboard, it stays in the cut nicely, it's easy to control, it just works well. That's one of the benefits you get of these blade shapes with relatively high tips and these long gradual curves to them. They work well for those extended cuts. Now there are a couple compromises on the blade. Because this is less of a tall blade, it's not going to be as thin behind the edge, not quite as sharp and slicey as some other, if you're used to Spydercos or even some other Giant Mouses that have similar blade stock but have more space to drop. Again, like the Biblio is going to be sharper behind the edge than this one. You only really feel that with delicate, lightweight tasks when you're cutting, say, plant stems or cutting tape or something like that, but you do feel it in those cases. So this ends up being a very nice EDC blade shape on a very nice EDC blade because the whole thing is so light and slim, and it is sharp enough to do pretty much anything you would need from it. Not going to be screaming sharp, not going to be the sharpest knife in your collection, but it is plenty sharp enough. And MagnaCut is a very good choice for a blade like this. The extra toughness you get out of MagnaCut relative to a lot of other popular steels, and the fact that it is so corrosion resistant, supports the sort of general EDC use case of this knife, which is really, it ends up being a knife that you can push a little bit harder than you typically would for a light and slim EDC like this. And you don't have to worry about it rusting, you don't have to worry about it breaking, anything like that, because they did pick a relatively tough and corrosion-resistant steel for that. So this ends up being, both in the blade shape and the handle shape, a really solid EDC option, in the sense that it's just going to be, it's going to take up very little space, it's going to be very unobtrusive, and this blade and this handle are going to be very good at just about everything. It's not going to be your best slicer. It's not going to be your best utility cutter. It's not going to be your sharpest knife. It's not going to be your best for big tasks, but it will do all of that well. And there's nothing really that this knife struggles at. There are some things it could do a little bit better, but it will do everything well enough. There are two areas, when we go to our negatives here, two areas that it can improve. The first one is the detent is very late. So late the detent, how late or early it is basically when you disengage this knife, how long until it goes up on the detent ball. Because you know the way this works, you've got your little detent ball there, and if you disengage your liner lock here, and then it's not up on the detent ball, the blade stops, and there's a kick right there until it goes up on the detent ball. And so if you just sort of aren't paying attention to what you're doing, and you just release the liner lock quickly, it'll get stuck there, and then you've got to push past the detent ball. And you've actually got to push the liner lock pretty far over for it to really drop down past that detent ball. If you just push it down a bit, it'll get caught just like that, and then you've got to push it down, and it's not insignificant to overcome that detent ball when it gets stuck right there. It is a very late detent, and it's something that's a learning curve with this knife. When I first got it, it was getting caught on that detent ball. I can't do it now because I'm adapted to it, but it was getting caught on that detent ball all the time, and I was having to push it close because that detent is so late. If they add either a detent ramp, or they just made the detent earlier, I'll bring out the Biblio here. So the Biblio, the detent, it goes on the detent ball there, barely when you release it. This is the way that most knives are. And so most of the time, if you give it even a little push, you'll get past that. The REO, you just have to push way further to get past the detent ball, and so the action can feel a little funky until you get used to it. The easy way to fix that is you just either push the liner lock way over, and it'll drop, or you get used to basically sort of slamming it down with your other finger. Those both work. It's just a learning curve. And the action, while there's no play, and while it is super smooth, it does feel a little rattly while it's opening and closing. You absolutely feel that this is a bearings action, and you've got, balls rolling on something here. It's sort of like a slightly cheaper feeling version of the feeling you get with something like a Koenig Arius, where it's not like gliding, it feels like it's rolling, and sometimes it can just feel a little rattly. There isn't any play even when it's unlocked, so it's fine. It just cheapens the feel a little bit. It's probably just down to the details of the bearings that they use, and it might be a consequence of just the knife being so light. But the action is great from a functional perspective, opens easily, closes easily, but it just feels a little rattly sometimes. Not a huge deal, but it's something that could be a little bit better on this knife. But honestly, not many complaints really when you look at this overall, which brings us to value, fit, and finish. So this is a $195 knife made in Italy by Giant Mouse. So designed in the US in Michigan, made in Italy. MagnaCut, denim micarta scales with a relatively complex pattern. Steel liner lock. For $195, this isn't bad. It's a lot better than Giant Mouse historically has been. Giant Mouse historically has had some challenges with value. To put it this way, this Biblio retails for more than this REO, and this Biblio is way thicker, way heavier, and just feels way less refined than the REO here. So these old Giant Mouse knives, the value is always a bit of a caveat on them. This one doesn't feel expensive. It certainly doesn't feel cheap, but if you think about the amount of milling effort that goes into this handle pattern, you think of the fact that it is MagnaCut, it's a nicely finished blade. The plunge is done very nicely. The grind is done very nicely. The way they knock down this opening hole, the way they do the jimping, again, this giant mouse jimping where they go up on the blade there is fantastic. The chamfers all around the handle. The screws are flush, or at least if they're a little bit proud, they're meant to be a little bit proud because they're domed like that. Everything is knocked down. You've got crowning on the spine. You've got nicely knocked down edges here. The backspacer seats very nicely. It's flush except for the lanyard hole, which is meant to stick out. You've got, again, nested liners that nest very invisibly. Even the liner lock here is knocked down a bit on the edges in a way that doesn't prevent you from accessing it, and they even put a couple milling lines in that liner lock there, which just makes it a little easier to disengage. When I look at everything in this package, I'm not going to complain about this for $195. I can see how $195 of machining and design, time and effort and materials went into this. And when I compare this to other things on the market, if I compare this to a TRM Atom or a TRM Neutron, this feels competitive. Now, this is made in Italy, not made in the US, so if made in the US is important to you, then maybe it feels a little expensive in that comparison, but the fact is, Italy's still a first world nation. This feels, and frankly, if you got diamond pattern scales from TRM, you're going to be well over $200 for your Atom, which is the most comparable knife to this one. So value here, surprisingly good for Giant Mouse. Not that it's very good value, but Giant Mouse sometimes sucks on value, and this one is solid. I can see how they got to that price here. Biggest competition for this is probably your TRM Atom. Let me go get mine pretty quickly here. So there is my Atom. This is very similar in shape and design and overall use case to the Atom, though it is an even slightly sleeker knife than the Atom. It is lighter. It is about the same thickness, maybe a little thicker. Again, you've got the contoured scales here. To get contoured and diamond pattern scales from TRM, you're going well above that $200 price point. And obviously the TRM is on washers here rather than being on bearings, made in the US, made in Italy. This is really, one of the easiest ways to think about this is a more fidgety and more just sort of refined version of the Atom. The Atom is meant to be a workhorse. This has a little bit more pizzazz, a little bit more show to it. But it functions very similarly. It's got this blade shape similarly, is very easy to get in and around stuff, very easy to poke at stuff, cuts more than well enough. It's not a supreme slicer like the Atom, but it cuts more than well enough for everything you need. And the handle ergonomics, while not quite as secure in the hand as the supremely great ergonomics of the Atom, it's also even smaller in the pocket than the Atom. So you are saving a little bit on pocket space with these ergonomics. And honestly, the ergonomics are pretty close to being just as good. And the action is obviously freer, faster, all that. So this competes very well against the Atom, and that's sort of the best comparison I can think of. You can also compare it to something like the Sebenza or other knives that are sort of thin in the pocket and meant to have utility like this one, but that comparison starts to get a little bit more strained. So in summary, what are my overall thoughts on this knife? This is one of the best knives that Giant Mouse has made, and in 2024, if somebody asks me, okay, I'm new to Giant Mouse, what Giant Mouse should I start with? Or just I'm interested in, knives in this range, what's a good one to start with in general? Because Giant Mouse was the first high-end or higher-end brand that I tried. And really, review coming up on this one, but I'm going to tell you, if you're picking a Giant Mouse in 2024 and you're starting off, it's going to be the Riv or the REO based on what sort of size you want. These are the two best knives that Giant Mouse is making right now for general uses. This is a very good EDC knife. Again, the carry profile is fantastic. This is very, very light, almost disappears in the pocket. The level of finishing that they are going for and have achieved on this knife is a serious step up from what they used to do. The blade shape here has more than enough utility for all of your EDC tasks. Is this a knife I'd choose to break down cardboard boxes for an hour? No, but it actually will do that task well enough. Is this what I would do what I would choose to shave grapes? No, but it will do that task well enough. This is a true EDC in the sense that it will do everything that you need quite well, quite effectively, and it does it while taking up as little space as possible and also being just a nice object. It's fun, it's refined, it's nice to hold, it's nice in the hand, it's nice to look at. There's lots of little details that make this more refined and just more interesting than a lot of other giant mouse stuff. And so this ends up being a very, very good EDC option at $195. It's easy to recommend if you're playing in that price range and if the features of this knife appeal to you. So it ends up being a very good and very recommendable knife in general. Now, for me personally, am I keeping it? That's still open for debate. And that really comes down to my personal preferences, and it does come down to this comparison right here with the Atom, and to an extent with my Sebenza as well. I love the Atom. The Atom works very, very well, and this knife is very similar in terms of use case to the Atom. I would use the REO here for just about the same tasks as the Atom. I've already got the Atom. I guess I've already got the REO as well, but I could more easily, I've bonded with this one. I've had this one for months. I've had an Atom for years. The REO is more new to me. I also personally prefer the sort of slower, more controlled action on something like an Atom to the fidgety action like of the REO, even though it is fun. I do prefer the handles on the REO. The fact that this is so slim in the pocket and this diamond texture pattern is done so well. I don't see myself on a value comparison. I actually see this as a better value than a TRM Atom with micarta diamond textured handles, which becomes a knife that is almost $100 more expensive than the REO when you take all that into account. So if I didn't have either one, I would be seriously considering the REO here, but the fact is this blade is a little slimmer. I do get a little bit more utility out of the Atom, and where the REO is sort of a knife that is good at everything but exceptional at nothing, the Atom is a knife that is good at everything and actually is exceptional at a few things. This is one of the knives that I would choose to shave grapes. This is a fantastic, super slicey EDC knife, where this one is just very good. And so for me personally, in this comparison, the REO comes up just a little bit short. It's a great knife, and if I had a collection of 50 knives, then it would certainly warrant a spot. But for me, it's going to come down to, I'm going to keep it and use it for a little bit longer. But in this comparison, I personally like my Atom a little bit better than the REO, but that really does come down to my personal preferences more than a value judgment on the knife as a whole. I can see myself keeping this for 5 more years. This one is fun, it's nice to have, but I don't know if I'm going to have it 5 years from now. But that's really me. And so those are my thoughts on your Giant Mouse Ace REO. We went well over the 15 minutes here. We're close to 25, but we'll see if we can get to 15 in the future. I hope you found that helpful, and I hope you feel better informed than you did 25 minutes ago. Follow along for more, and I hope to see you again soon.